Hi, Dr. Alasdair. Welcome to Network Capital. You don't need much of an introduction, but it'll be wonderful to hear the way you identify yourself. What do you do for a living, and what got you interested?
I'm a professor. Right now, I'm a professor of public policy at University of Massachusetts Amherst, which is the main campus, the so-called flagship campus of the University of Massachusetts. And I'm also director of the School of Public Policy at UMass Amherst too. I'm Canadian. I'm a Canadian citizen. I started my scholarly career in Canada. Started off in political science, actually, at a place called Queen's University. I did a law degree at the University of Toronto. And then I did a master's degree and a PhD in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and then worked in a variety of different places. I worked in Canada for 10 years at Syracuse University, the Maxwell School of Public Affairs, for 8 years. I was on the faculty there. I was a law professor in Boston for 8 years, and I've also worked at the Truman School of Public Affairs in Missouri, and now, of course, I'm here. So I've been around many different places, but always interested in public policy. But I think the one thing I probably distinguishes me a bit from other public policy professors is that I've also got this background in law and political science as well.
Yeah, we're always fascinated by intersections, law, public policy, technology. When did you know that you wanted to transition from law to policy, and what was early career?
Well, I started off in political science when I was an undergraduate, and I did 2 years of political science, and I realized I was active in politics at the time, and I realized that political science was a little too abstract for me. I liked something a little more concrete. So I decided to try law. So I did a law degree, but then I realized, and that has proved to be very advantageous, but I realized that law, in a sense, is too far in the other direction. Sometimes it's very down in the details. You're arguing about words or text, and that wasn't quite where I wanted to be either. And actually, so I looked at public administration or public policy. Those are two closely related fields, and one of my law professors suggested that I apply to Harvard. And I should tell you, I'm the first person in my family to go to university. So the thought of going to Harvard would never have crossed my mind if he had not raised it. So to humor him, basically, I applied and I got in. And that has proved to be where I like to be. I really enjoy studying policy problems because they're important. You're talking about improving the welfare of ordinary people, and they're complex. They're like puzzles. It's trying to figure out how you address a policy problem is very challenging, and you really have to bring in all kinds of knowledge. You have to think like an economist sometimes. You have to think like a bureaucrat sometimes. How exactly are you going to make this policy work? You have to think like a lawyer sometimes. What in a liberal democracy like India is acceptable, and sometimes you have to think like an ethicist. What's the fair thing to do? So they're important, complicated puzzles.
Super interesting, super difficult puzzles to solve. But it's great to know. I actually did not know you're the first person in your family to go to college. It must be such an incredible delight to now teach thousands of students around the world. Even this masterclass will go out to many, many thousands of people. And I'm sure they'll find it deep inspiration in what you just said. Policy issues, Dr. Alasdair, tend to be tricky. Why should one pursue a master's or an advanced degree in policy space instead of actually going on the ground and talking to people and building a community and starting work? How did you see it? What do you observe, or what do you remember from your student time, and what do you observe among students today?
Well, the getting on the ground experience is good, and many graduate programs in public policy value having some kind of experience in the field when they're looking at applications. I think that doing a policy degree gives you an advantage because it improves your skill in thinking through policy problems in a systematic way. It's giving you substantive knowledge about how to solve policy problems that draws ideally from many different disciplines. And it's also cultivating the professional skills that you need to succeed in the workplace. Communication skills, writing skills, analytic skills, and so on. And I should say too, the third thing that is advantageous is that it gets you into a network. You join a community. And when I went to the Kennedy School, the curriculum was fine, but one of the most exciting things was being in a community of people who had a similar interest. And years later, I still keep in touch with that group. I should qualify. I do want to say that there's one thing about the public policy degree is the versatility of it. You can talk about going into public service, directly into government, but you might end up working in a non-governmental organization, or you might even work in the private sector, because many companies are either regulated by government or they interact heavily with government, or they need to have a position on one policy question or another. And so very often private sector firms find it advantageous to have somebody with a policy background as well. It's also a very nice complement to specialized degrees. If you've got a more focused degree, perhaps in one of the professions, having a policy degree is a second degree is a nice complement.
I mean, I used to work at Microsoft, and there was a team that looked at policy specifically, and many of them tended to be lawyers or people who would study policy stuff. But that's not what you did after, right? Like you decided to get into academia. Why did you do that? And did you always know that you wanted to be a professor?
No, I stumbled from one thing to another. I'm not one of the persons who had sort of a long run game plan. The story I told you before is I started in political science and I realized, oh, that's not quite right. Move into law, that's not quite right. Move into public policy. I enjoy being an academic. It's not for everybody, but it gives you a certain degree of freedom to explore questions that you're interested in and to write about things that you're interested in. As a career, academia has its own requirements and hurdles you have to jump, but it has certain advantages too. It gives you a lot of flexibility. I would say one of the disadvantages is that sometimes you're not as engaged in on the ground reform. You're not in the action. You're not in the fight, as it were. So that can be a bit of a trade-off.
Yeah. So you, like every interesting person on Network Capital, you also stumbled upon different insights, decided to become an academic. But let's start early on. So in your master's, it seems like the community was really important and the breadth. Yeah. When you started PhD, as we understand, is fairly depth-based. How did you identify the problem, and how did you, defend it eventually?
I'm sorry, I missed the middle part of what you were saying. It cut out on the audio.
Yeah, I was just saying that your PhD question, what was it all about, and what were those years pursuing PhD? It must be a different experience.
Yeah, I'm not sure. My dissertation was I had a topic that I was going to pursue and I put it aside. And this was many years ago. The topic I was thinking about pursuing was the way in which international trade agreements affected national sovereignty. And I didn't do that topic. And that was a mistake. So, because that proved to be the topic for the next 20 years or so. I actually looked at a somewhat different topic, looking at administrative reform, what we would call today the development of state capabilities, which is still interesting. Um, but that's sort of the main area I got into. And then, later on, I explored different areas. I've done a lot of work on right to information, for example, or freedom of information, as we would call it in North America. I've actually done a lot of work on right to information in India, which is a fascinating case. There's a fascinating case where it's not just about policy design, but also about implementation. How do you make the policy work on the ground?
Yeah.
And recently been doing a lot of thinking about how we make democracies work. How do we structure governments that are capable of delivering essential services like education and healthcare, and capable of responding to emergencies like a pandemic, while also respecting democratic norms like the right to participate in government, civil liberties, and so on. Because I think that's for me, one of the big challenges of the coming years.
Yeah, we hosted a professor from Yale who studies democracies as well, Helen Laundemore, and she had some pretty interesting ideas about open democracy. I wonder what your ideas were about making democracies. What's your thesis? Because I think a lot of countries could do with a refresher on what that entails.
I think generally, I have for many years been an advocate of open government and the extension of democratic principles. The other thing too is that we don't sometimes recognize that democratic governance is a relatively new phenomenon, in the sense that it's really only been around for 60 or 70 years. The Republic of India is 70 odd years old now. Yeah. Really, the voting rights were not fully extended in the United States until the 1960s. In other democracies, voting rights really weren't extended to the mid 20th century. So in the long run, the scheme of things, 60 or 70 years is really not that much. And we're still in the process of figuring out, okay, exactly how do we make democracy work? And it's not straightforward. You have to figure out how you want to structure political competition, where you want to apply democratic principles rigorously or where you don't. Maybe there's some areas where you want to leave responsibilities to the experts and basically say, okay, like we sometimes do with central banking, we say, okay, we're going to let the experts figure out what to do on that. But, and you wouldn't want to elect certain kinds of folks. So the big challenge is not just are we in favor of democracy, but how do we express it in institutions? And are there areas where we wouldn't want to apply democratic principles rigorously? That's the sort of that's one of the puzzles we have to figure out. And I should say that when you look around the world, India is the country where these questions just come to the fore quite dramatically, because there are tremendous questions about building state capabilities in India that need to be addressed. As I was saying, health care, education, public security, and so on. And of course, it's also the world's biggest and most vibrant democracy. So, and these questions about how much democracy do you want? How do you balance democracy and civil rights, civil liberties? How much power do you give to the center versus the states? There's lots to talk about in the Indian case.
Yeah, India is a fascinating case study. Do you get a lot of Indian students at UMass?
Yes, we do get a lot of Indian students at UMass. I couldn't give you the statistic, but we have a very significant population. This is a big campus. I believe we have between 30 and 40,000 students, and it's a quite diverse campus as well.
What is your class like? What does a day in your life look like? How much of it is thinking about big thorny problems, how much of that is writing, how much of that is teaching, how much is doing master classes like this one?
Well, that's a good question. So I'm an administrator, so I spend probably about, as I think about it, the hours won't add up. I spend a considerable amount of time just doing work in planning for the school and thinking about the day-to-day running of the school. I also teach a course. Right now I'm doing an introduction to public administration for undergraduate students here, but I've also done a course on comparative public policy. And then maybe about 25% of my time is on research and writing and having conversations like this, conferences and so on.
Yeah. The pandemic changed a lot, right? For universities, for public policy, for families. So as an academic, as well as somebody who thinks about these questions, what do you think is the role of the university in the post-pandemic world? And what did you learn as an administrator in the past year and a half?
Well, it has been a very challenging time. It sort of manifested in a couple of different ways. Obviously, we had the public health aspect. That is, how do we run our operations in a way that's safe for everybody involved? We also had the technology aspect. How do we adapt to a new environment? And I think we've learned a lot. And in the span, it was a very concentrated learning experience, but we've broken a lot of barriers in terms of how we think about doing our work. There was also an economic aspect because a lot of institutions, public and private, had to go through a pretty significant retrenchment, austerity measures because of the pandemic, and like all public universities, we've gone through that too. That's a short-term phenomenon that will start to reverse fairly quickly. But I think one of the most interesting things is that we have really broken down, as I was saying, a lot of, I'm not sure if resistance is the right word to use, to the idea of using new technologies in education and doing what we're doing right now. Yeah. So in 2019, the idea of having a conversation like this for most professors would have been unorthodox, and now it's standard, right? And everyone's got the drill. They've got the technology, not everyone, but many people have got the technology. They understand how to unmute themselves. They've sort of got the routine. We've also learned how to use learning platforms, Moodle, Blackboard, and so on. So we've become much more versatile in how we do our work. And I think going forward, even when we start getting back on campus, and we're cautiously optimistic that we'll be back on campus in the fall, that we will still use a lot of these technologies. So for example, even if I'm teaching a class in person, does every session have to be in person? One of the things we've learned is that bringing a guest speaker into a class using this technology is very, very easy. Bringing a guest speaker onto campus used to be very difficult. But if we're bringing a guest speaker in and we're doing it by Zoom, why do we need to gather in the classroom? Everyone could just stay at home that day and say we're going to connect. You wouldn't want to run an entire class that way, but doing something that way would be good.
Another thing.
Conferences, academic conferences have gone entirely online. And one of the things we've realized is that it breaks down barriers to accessibility. People who couldn't travel to a conference can participate on a conference online. Yeah. We did our graduation ceremony last year online by necessity, and we'll have to do it again online this spring by necessity. But one of the things we observed is that we had all of the students in a Zoom meeting doing our graduation ceremony, but many students were connecting from their homes with their extended families behind them in their living room. And these are people who never would have had the opportunity to participate in the ceremony before. So I think the future is going to look like a blend of old and new.
Yeah, will be, which makes me wonder what will happen to the cost. I mean, you're an administrator in a prominent school, that's in policy. Does it bother you that education is growing or has been growing in the past few years at 8 times the cost of the income, perhaps? So, what might do you think COVID and the blended learning will change that? How should people looking to apply for policy schools uh, think of this entire experience? What would it really be? Something similar, or would it be even better, perhaps?
So remind me that let's make sure we do cover this question about looking at schools and where to look, because otherwise it'll slip my mind. But
yeah, let's cover the cost angle
yeah.
first.
But the cost thing is this bothers me. This question bothers me a lot. The question of how do we create opportunities for individuals who are interested in public policy to get a quality education at a reasonable cost. And there should be opportunities, especially from what we've learned over the last year, to deliver programs to individuals in a more effective, cost-effective way. And I would very much like to explore that. I've had for many years, for example, an interest in India. I visit India about once a year. And I know there's a lot of young professionals in India who are interested in public policy. Coming to the United States to do a policy degree is a very expensive proposition.
Yeah.
And I one of the things I am sort of tossing around is the question of how do we develop more innovative ways of doing that. I will say one of the predicaments for American universities is basically salary structures. A lot of the costs of American public universities is basically tied up in payroll.
I see.
Faculty and staff salaries, and so the challenge is figuring out how, for the schools in the short run, not the long run, is the question of how do you restructure operations in such a way that you're making the product more accessible and affordable, maintaining quality, and also basically covering your fixed costs.
Yeah, I do feel that the cost structure has been changing. For example, the support staff in many colleges or universities. I think for many months, nobody was allowed, and they were the first people in many places to be let go or to be furloughed, and so forth. Do you see the nature of employment change? Do you think adjunct faculty would become more popular? Do you think support staff would be outsourced? Would it be flexible working? Because the goal is to cut costs to make education more accessible. You need to start somewhere. I wonder where that somewhere might be.
Well, in the long run, when people are thinking about the tricky bit, I mean, you could imagine hiring adjuncts to teach online courses. Yeah. You're going to have quality control. You've got to think carefully about quality control, making sure you're delivering a high quality program. You've also got to think about fairness to the adjuncts. And there's an active debate in the United States, because the predicament is you've got a generation of scholars who are tenured faculty, basically like the fellow you're talking to, who are very well paid, who have job security. We're not going away anytime soon, and we have a work model where we teach sometimes and we research sometimes. So part of our job,
without research, there's no university.
Right. And the normal model for an academic is, I don't want to say normal, but a common model is so-called 40-40-20, which is you do 40% teaching, 40% research. This is allocation of time, 20% service or administration. So, the challenge is thinking about how you staff programs in such a way that you're treating workers fairly, and you're also preserving the traditional function of universities in encouraging research and protecting the autonomy of researchers. You know, the other difficulty is if you went to a world of adjuncts on short-term contracts, not only would they not have time to do research, precisely because they're on short-term contract, they'd be more vulnerable to political pressures on their research.
Criticize anything. I think you may be aware of some recent
yes
education political interference that has been alluded to. And I think it's very important to remind ourselves why universities exist. And these are important questions: cost, the purpose of university. Is it teaching? Is it research? Is it combination? How do you be fair to everybody? And I think that's what makes your job such an interesting job, right? You're literally trying to address these questions for students, for the university, for your other colleagues in other places. What is the most challenging part about doing your job or being in your position? And how have you tried to figure that challenge out?
The principal challenge, and it's not peculiar to this particular institution, is working entrepreneurially in a bureaucracy. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but you're talking about a very big organization that has lots of systems and policies. And so trying to figure out how to do things in a new way and creatively, while also kind of navigating all the rules and requirements. That's the particular challenge. And as you know, just to combine that with the previous point, the thing, as I said, I am mainly thinking about is how do we make public policy education more generally accessible, given those constraints.
I think, this is these trade-offs will define how the 21st century really look like. Look, one option is that, the way network capital looks like, it's an unbundled education experience. People participate in different fellowships, public policy, product, investing, and they graduate with the community, the network. They learn from very interesting faculty, say yourself, and your colleagues and other practitioners around the world. And then they get one-on-one mentorship. Initially, all of this was supposed to happen in a university. But then somewhere along the way, the university in general as an institution became expensive, slightly more bureaucratic than one would have hoped, and out of touch with times. So we are observing the unbundling of the education, where different organizations are doing different part of all of it. What worries me, and I would love your thoughts on it, is that university is not just an educational experience.
Right.
It's also fairly a social experience. I'm sure your students come down, have a cup of coffee with you, or just hang out. That arguably would have gone down in 2020. So university, if it plays a deeper role, a larger role, how do we bring some of those benefits to those who perhaps don't want to go to university or perhaps can't afford it? Have you thought about that?
So yes, and one solution would be some kind of blended format. So for example, could you imagine? And so I'm in the business of at the moment of doing graduate public policy education, right? So can you imagine a blended format where people are doing some components of the degree online at a distance, but then they also gather together. Perhaps they gather together for an intensive period of a few weeks. Perhaps they come to campus. Perhaps the campus comes to them. In the sense that, so you're trying to basically to do some work remotely, but you're also trying to build, because the human connection that people also want to get out of their degree. And so you could imagine a scenario where they do a semester online and perhaps they come on campus for 2 or 3 weeks intensively.
Yeah.
And then they go back online, iterate that 2 or 3 times maybe. Or maybe it's an instance in which you've got a central university that basically says, okay, we're going to send instructors out to one city or another and do some kind of intensive session there. So there's got to be creative ways of kind of blending the modalities.
Yeah, I think it's a lot like companies that have really got remote work, right, are the ones who figured out that short bursts of intense interaction is great. And then we can go back to our own like hoods, do our work, and perhaps meet again in a few months for a short burst and go back. But I think it's an interesting time to be in a position as yours. How is the school like looking at it in the coming years? Are you hearing feedback from your students? Are they worried about their job prospects? What's the environment like in university these days?
I think at the moment, it has been a challenge. It's been a challenging moment for, I think, every member of the university community, including students. There's been a high degree of stress. The people have been balancing many conflicting demands on their time. They're shifting to online education, but perhaps they've got family obligations as well. Perhaps they've got a member of their family who's become ill because of the pandemic. Perhaps they've got someone in their family who's lost a job because of the pandemic. Yeah. So it's been a very intense period and very challenging. And one of the things we've tried to do is to accommodate that by making adjustments to schedule, by showing some flexibility, by building opportunities for people to come together casually, obviously to the extent you can using Zoom. And so one of the realities is, and this is probably true in all spheres of human activity, is when everyone's stressed, there is a danger that small problems become big problems. That kind of buffer or reserve that is normally there isn't there. So you have to sort of manage carefully. And I think people are wondering what comes next. I would have to say, though, over the last month or so, now that the vaccination program is rolling out, and the economic recovery program that's been put in place here has been adopted by Congress, I think people are much more optimistic about where we're going to be 6 or 7 months from now than they were back in January. I'm expecting we'll be back in something like normal operating mode by late August in terms of our own operations. And I have a hunch the economic activity will bounce back fairly quickly once we get through the vaccination period.
Right, but that's key. How, you've been thinking about democracy and other things. How did democracy thrive or perish in the pandemic? Do you have thoughts on that? Did you have thoughts on that?
Well, there's a whole bundle of things going on, right? It's and it's hard to unpack. I'm actually just starting to write a book that's going to have to say something about the pandemic. And just before we got on, one of the things, I've got to do a presentation in a few weeks for which I am not prepared. But the book is basically looking at 4 countries: India, China, the European Union, bear with me in calling that a kind of, it's not really a country, but it's a polity, and the United States. And the premise of the book is that these are basically super states. They're incredibly large. India is projected to have a population of 1.7 billion people by 2050. It will be the most populous country in the world. It'll be ahead of China by that point in terms of population. And these are just extraordinary numbers. And the question is how you govern countries this big, and how you govern them without resorting to authoritarian policies like China does. But one of the interesting questions is, well, we just had a natural experiment, right, where the same shock, the pandemic, hit 4 very different political systems: China, India, the European Union, and the US. Yeah. And an interesting question is, which one of those systems handled it most effectively and which didn't.
Well, everyone wants
and part of the question is, did being a democracy hurt or help in a situation like that? And this is one of. Sorry, go ahead.
The answer seems to be something, but is it an obvious answer? Or is it not an obvious answer?
It's not obvious. Authoritarianism proved to have. Well, it's got its pros and cons. Part of the difficulty with authoritarian rule is that you don't get early notice about looming problems, which is what happened in China. But on the other hand, you have the capacity to crack down firmly when you acknowledge the problem, which happened in China. Part of it in the Indian case is interesting. You had a lockdown which was problematic in many ways. Part of this is a question of what the division of responsibilities between the center and the states. And that's, I think, an aspect in the Indian case. But the other difficulty is the challenge in a pandemic is having well-crafted policies, but also persuading the public to comply with those policies,
right,
and doing that while respecting civil liberties and political freedom, basically. That has proved to be a huge challenge in many places.
Yeah. It has, and we're still figuring it out. Like, I think this pandemic, as historian Yuval Noah Harari says, pandemics accelerate history. And public policy, unfortunately, gets the rap of always playing catch up. So do you have any advice for your students looking at public policy as a career? Do public policy professionals and academics always first observe and then form a theory, or what's one thing they should be aware of when they look at public policies and emergencies, pandemic being a prime example?
Well, the one preliminary I would make is that we're focused on the pandemic because we're living through it right now. But in the U.S., for example, the last 20 years have been a succession of crises of one kind or another. There you had the 9/11 attacks and the challenge of homeland security. Then you had the global financial crisis and the response to that. You've had increasing number of natural disasters and growing questions about what government should do in that. And then also this pandemic. And the common theme in all of those crises is the responsibility of government to provide security in one kind of way, whether it's health security, economic security, security against natural disasters, security against terrorist attacks. And there are these growing expectations on government, especially central government in the US, to be able to manage. So basically we're looking at an expansion, more things being put on the shoulders of central government. And then the question of, can central government handle these responsibilities competently? Does it have the capacity to do it? So in a way that we've ratcheted up the expectations for government in this century. My own view on how you should think about governance is that it's in large part about improvisation. You're talking about policymakers who are limited in their capacity to understand the complex systems they're governing, and limited in their capacity to predict what will happen in the future. And therefore, you can never be entirely sure whether you've got the right policy or what the policy will do. And so you are, to some degree, engaged in improvisation. You're devising a solution or a bundle of policies that you think will work. and even the best crafted bundle of policies is eventually going to collapse in the sense that the formula you had for governing at one point of time, there's no permanent solution. It will inevitably be the case that you'll have to reinvent the way you govern. And this has happened in the Indian case. You've seen it, since the 1970s, 2 or 3, substantial shifts and understandings about the best way to govern the country.
Yeah.
Which goes back to the point I was making earlier on, that it's like trying to solve a puzzle whose structure is constantly changing as you're trying to solve it. So I don't know if you're familiar with Rubik's cubes, but I say,
I have one right in front of me.
So imagine trying to solve a Rubik's cube where the colors on all the little boxes are changing as you're trying to solve it. That's governance.
That'll be pretty challenging. But I think that's what makes everything that you do so interesting. You're right. You think about the deepest problems, challenging problems. You engage with students. You look at administrative issues. It sounds like a real fulfilling, holistic job for the right person. The same job could be very difficult or not right for another kind of person, but it seems like you found home in a mixture of academia and writing and practice.
Yes, yeah. And I should say, just a word about if people are thinking about applying for graduate programs.
They are. Many of our folks apply in hundreds, actually. Yeah.
So, one thing, I was fortunate to go to the Kennedy School at Harvard. It was a wonderful opportunity. But the market, and there is a tendency sometimes to focus on the sort of big name universities, the familiar ones like Columbia, Harvard, and so on. If people are thinking about the U.S. market for public policy schools, the one thing to bear in mind is that the market, in terms of possible schools, is quite deep, and there are some very good schools that would not ordinarily come to mind. And one thing that people could do if they're interested is look at, there's something called the U.S. News ranking of graduate programs.
Many of our community members do take a look at that.
So, and in fact, the rankings for the public affairs schools the new rankings will be coming out on March 30th shortly. The one caveat, and when you look at the list, you'll see many schools on the list that near the top of the list that might not ordinarily come to mind. So for example, the Maxwell School at Syracuse University is very highly regarded. I believe it for a long time was the #1 ranked school in that list, but for international students Syracuse University might not come up, but it's an outstanding school. There are many good schools in the DC area as well. The one thing to bear in mind about that ranking, however, is that unlike the rankings of some other professional schools, the public affairs ranking is purely reputational. That is to say, they basically do a poll of people who run public affairs programs and ask them to rank the other public affairs programs. So it's a little, you have to take the ranking with a grain of salt. It's not by any means of science. And it also suffers from a serious lag effect. So, for example, we've added 10 faculty in the last year or so at our school. But word about that will have to trickle out. So that won't show up on our rankings for 3 or 4 years. So, but having said that, looking at that list does give you a broader sense of options. The other thing that folks might want to bear in mind is the critical difference in the American context between public and private universities, just in terms of pricing and affordability.
Yeah. And I think that's something that many times people don't even know. They think that a public university is the same as private, or East Coast is the same as the West Coast.
Exactly,
so know what kind of career opportunities open up, Where are you culturally a good fit? Where would you, find many intangible factors that are working in your flavor? And one thing that I wanted your opinion on is that international students coming to study policy, there was a time where many of them found jobs at the UN, World Bank, so on and so forth. That has reduced a bit for international students across all schools, and that is something which is slightly unfortunate, because the whole premise of going to a different country to study is to be able to work there also for some time. Do you think this remote or distributed work era would be helpful for policy professionals and students, because geography will become less of a factor?
And I should say, by the way, I was also basically an international student at a U.S. program, and granted from Canada, but I sympathize with the predicament, because, if you're interested in pursuing opportunities in the country, it can be a bit challenging.
Yeah.
And and on that note, one of the things when you're thinking about a program, you do want to think about pricing, and the public-private distinction matters there. Location matters, and you also want to look at the school, and because public affairs programs have many different emphases. So for example, Carnegie Mellon's very good on tech and public policy. Other schools have more of an emphasis on social justice, or different flavors, as it were. The question of figuring out how to seek opportunities domestically is challenging. Having some time after you complete your degree to kind of look around is important. If you do a graduate degree in public affairs, you do get, and I'm not an expert on the visa status, but an opportunity after the
optional practical training.
Exactly, OPT, yeah. The other thing I sort of tell folks, and this actually goes for anybody, domestic or international, is that when you start, from the moment you start your degree, start thinking about what kind of story you want to tell employers when you're done your degree. Think about who you'd like to get at, and then craft your educational experience to the extent you can to put together a portfolio. And sometimes people think, okay, that means that if I get in a degree program, I should do track X or certificate X, and I don't quite mean it that way. You want to be able to talk to a prospective employer when you're done and say, I have a real interest in topic X. And for example, whenever I could, I wrote a research paper on topic X, or I chose elective courses that were on topic X. So it's not just sort of demonstrating that you've done a certificate or a track. It's like demonstrating that, I've actually been thinking about this particular problem.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing you can do is every time you have an opportunity to write a research paper in your graduate program, you're presented with an opportunity to basically go knock on doors, metaphorically speaking, and introduce yourself to people that it would be, useful to know in the long run. People rarely turn down an inquiry from a student who asks, could I have 20 minutes of your time to ask you a couple questions about a research paper I'm writing? And so every research paper becomes an opportunity basically to make connections with the community that you're interested in engaging with. And then later on, when you get your paper done, you can send the person your paper and say, thanks for the opportunity to talk. Here's the paper I was working on, just so you know. So that's part of building a portfolio, but it's also about using the elements of the educational experience to build a network, to knock on the doors of the people you'd like to meet.
That is such a fantastic piece of advice. We often talk about this concept, luck surface area, which is a combination of doing great work, in this case is writing a great research paper, and telling lots of people. So I wrote a book, I think we briefly may have talked about it earlier, The Seductive Illusion of Hard Work. So one chapter in that book is focused on lux surface area. You should have it in your library, or perhaps I'll have it. Amazon has it in.
Yes,
Boston,
no, I've
so
already looked it up on or ordered it on Amazon. So, yeah.
So you'll enjoy. There are many students who will and young professionals who will listen to this concept. It's such a practical and tangible and easy way for people to forge a real connection based on a common intellectual inquiry. I just want to conclude today's session by asking you about how you learn and how you rethink. So as a busy person who has to, manage multiple portfolios and multiple priorities, when do you learn new things? And what's the process of rethinking look like for you?
So how do I learn new things? I read a lot. I mean, as you can see from over my shoulder, and let me just adjust the camera over there. More books over there. That incidentally is my India bookshelf. I have, what I do is when I write books, this book I'm doing will be my 9th book. I basically start off with some problem or puzzle that I think is interesting, and then I spend a lot of time reading. So that's my India pile. My China pile is back over there. My American book is piles over there. The EU is sitting up here. And I basically spend a couple of hours, an hour or so every morning just reading a book. I go through a book at the moment. I'm reading a very interesting book at the moment called The Dictator's Dilemma, which is about governance in China. And then I'll write up notes after I read the book. And then at a certain point, I try to put aside some time to do a little bit of writing every day. And I think actually that's advice that's on your on the Network Capital website as well.
Yeah, well, we can't wait to have you back with us soon. We also have a summer school, Alasdair, coming up where we have teenagers coming to learn.
Oh, so wonderful.
Lots to look forward to. And we should also do the graduate session soon.
Excellent. Good. Well, you're doing wonderful work. So congratulations and keep it up.
Well, our work lets us make new friends, people like you. So Alasdair, I see this as the beginning of a long-term partnership. Catch you very soon. And thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Have a great evening.
Yeah,
bye.
Bye. Take care.